Hello and welcome to We Are the Deluge, a spoiler-free chapter-by-chapter podcast about the climate change novel The Deluge by Stephen Markley. We're your co-hosts Emily Crandall and John McMahon. You can go ahead and diagnose us both with cases of social justice warrior apophenia. Today we are discussing The Years of Rain and Thunder Part 2, set in 2028, the second chapter from Matt's point of view, which we are presenting in the form of his true form, a long-form essay.
Oh my gosh, so good. There's so many good LOLs in this one about that stuff. It's like, I think this, I actually don't know. When we're finished, I'm going to go through and count my marginal LOLs and see which chapter has the most.
We can come up with so many contrived bits for once we're done with this novel
oh my
to
God,
go back and reflect on our experience. It's like season 2, a 14-part examination of the
podcast.
Yes.
I mean, I'm not opposed.
Same.
Okay, shall I lead us off with a catchy hook?
I can't wait to hear this hook.
Okay. So there's a moment in this chapter where a fierce blue fire, there's a couple moments, and we'll get into this in the summary, that are sort of the plot driving moments. But one is Matt talking about basically the transition from like a fierce blue fire being this sort of small scale thing to being like a big deal and being influential. And there's a particular, description of something that happens in that process where they're developing their virtual worlds.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like the world is this like these beautiful landscapes, right, where people can come to debate and listen to speakers and whatever. And then what's the other one? The
X-Spears.
Yes, X-Spears. It's like dark and apocalyptic. And this just clicked for me, and I can't believe I haven't thought about this yet. It immediately took me to Margaret Atwood's Mad Adam trilogy.
Great.
And I don't even think that this chapter is the most Mad Adam-y, but right, there is this like thing in the trilogy where the virtual world is a space that is sort of like democratic, but also that you can't trust. And there's all these other things.
I would know nothing about that. Yeah.
That they cite in this chapter that also are themes in those books. So like the question of what path do you take, right? Like what's the right course of action? The question about like whether technology can save us or whether we have to forego it, the kind of like secret terror organizations, the prevalence of sexual violence, which I think is something we've sort of talked about. Like, why is there a feminist discourse, right, in a novel about climate change? And we've talked about ecofeminism and stuff. And Margaret Atwood takes that up explicitly, right? That like, and I think both like as a way of diagnosing what happens sort of after the flood, but also as an analog.
The Deluge?
Yeah. Yes. You know. Oh no, already. But also as an analog for, right, like the violence visited upon nature. I think Margaret Atwood is explicitly ecofeminist in that sense. And then there's like the religious zealots and the groups that are about the like return to subsistence. And then I just was like, I can't believe I hadn't thought of those books while we've been reading this before. But I think because we're getting into the techno future stuff, it's starting to like have more obvious parallels. Like I would be surprised if that wasn't in some way a series that Markley had thought with or read or something like that. Have you read it?
I haven't actually read it. I mean, I know of it, of course, and have like read about it when I was prepping to teach this climate fiction class last semester, but I haven't actually read any of the books in the trilogy.
Okay. So there's I was trying to map it. There is almost a 1-for-1 like parallel to each of the points of view.
Okay.
In the novels. Yeah. Almost. But like some of them you have to stretch a little bit. So I don't know, maybe season 2 of The Deluge is the Mad Adam trilogy by Margaret Atwood.
Yeah. Well, you're going to have to finish the name for us. We are the...
I don't know. Like, we are the gardeners.
Oh, okay. All right.
Yeah. Okay, well, then I don't want to spoil it for you, but
to a podcast feed.
To a podcast platform near you. Yeah. Okay, I also, just to flag all the things that get mentioned in this chapter, we have David Bowie.
That's right.
Winnie the Pooh, the Alien movie franchise, Starship Troopers.
Yep.
There's a Saved by the Bell reference, AC Slater. This, I didn't know whether to put in like a cultural artifact section or an LOL section, but we can get to it later. References to Scientology and Nexium. And I'll explain why that's an LOL when we get there.
The specific context in which it's used is incredible. Like,
it's so good
as bars.
Also Pennywise from It.
Yeah. A rotund Pennywise. Or I forget the descriptor.
Tubby guy.
Tubby
dressed
Pennywise.
As Pennywise. Yeah. Yes. Like, oh my God, what a way to describe someone's Halloween costume. Yeah. Those are all the ones I caught.
Yeah, I would add the Colbert episode they talk about where Kate's the guest and she apparently single-handedly forces the media industry to consult its advertising relationship with extractivist interests. I
feel like so far that's the least plausible plot point of this novel.
Ooh, that's another game for that's for episode 2 of season 1.5.
Oh my God, I'm getting lost.
This is the problem. This is the bits just become real things and then you do them and they're great. Okay, I was having some trouble with cultural artifacts. Let me quickly run through the things I considered and rejected. I rejected an obvious cultural artifact bit about this is House of Cards if it was made by climate justice activists.
Oh, yeah, that's good though.
And then I rejected the bad jokes of it's like if Mr. Smith goes to Washington and Schoolhouse Rock, like took a bunch of weed and we're about climate.
Oh, I think.
But then I settled on ultimately the appropriate hook for this is the band Fugazi.
Oh my God. Okay. Please explain.
There's a shock and questioning look on Emily's face right now. So Washington, D.C. band, famously, right? Like one of the maybe 2 or 3 most iconic bands out of Washington, D.C. And this chapter is so Washington, D.C. centric and like trying to examine the texture of what it is like to exist in that space. Number 1. Number 2, so much of this chapter is the question of like, okay, what is normal and accepted as normality that's actually very fucked up? And what might then be the appropriate response if you are not willing to accept that as normal? And there's something about the relationship of Fugazi to the music industry that I think like very much captures a certain element of that, including the like, you know, the Fierce Blue Fire like starts off with this incredible idea. They want to reject entirely the system of even like their apparent allies or whatever. And instead they start something new from the grassroots or whatever. So there's something about the like DIY punk or post-hardcore ethos of Fugazi that works there. There's especially, I think this is like the key analogy, is them founding Discord Records that does it. And like that's the Fierce Blue Fire blows up and becomes its own like autonomous actor. Is the time at which like the Fugazi and crew are founding Discord.
I love that.
And so there's that, you know, the song Waiting Room is clearly about the character of Matt, even though he didn't exist yet. Tom definitely listens to Fugazi, but ironically, because he thinks they're too earnest. And then like, if we're thinking about specific Fugazi music, I think that the album's Repeater, so their first full length, and then their last full length, The Argument, are probably like the 2 relevant touch points. You know, songs like Blueprint, Repeater, The Argument, Cash Out, The Kill, these kinds of songs. So Fugazi and Ian Mackay is the white man, Kate Morris is the lesson.
I cannot tell you the last time I thought about the band Fugazi. Like it just like flew back into my brain when you mentioned it. And I was like, I don't know where it has been. That's so good. That's perfect. Wow. Amazing.
So yeah, that came to me like literally as I was walking to class this morning after having read the chapter we were going to talk about, and I had yet to figure something out.
That's so funny because I feel like I went with this is the meta, like, philosophical question in the chapter. And you were like, this is the actual meat of the chapter.
Well, it's more that, like, so I'm teaching this U.S. social movements class that is, like, way less theory than I usually do for a bunch of complicated reasons I'm not going to get into. And so there's something about the, like, social movement dynamics and, like, the internal, like, ethos, organization, structure, purpose, leadership, like that kind of stuff.
Right. That's like on your mind.
Exactly. I've been having to think about that so much in a different way than usual. So I think I was prone to focus on those parts of this chapter and apparently connected to Fugazi, a band I love.
That's really funny because you're going to see that I did something similar in my Galaxy Brain take.
Oh, I can't wait for that. Should we summarize this chapter, though?
Let's do it.
All right. The real introduction. Emily, what's your summary?
On the eve of a presidential election between an ineffective, spineless Democrat and a controversial Republican promising to act on climate, a fierce blue fire clashes internally over whether to endorse the Republican, whether to act with prudence or boldness, while Matt reflects on the decade that brought him out of ignorant bliss.
Is that a preview for Galaxy Brain?
Yes.
I can't wait.
That brought him out of ignorant bliss and into energized despair is where I landed.
Energized despair is great. And if that's not your episode title, I think you can add it on to whatever the episode title is.
Oh, actually, that's perfect. Yeah.
So I went with Matt self-consciously chronicles the tumultuous climate politics inside and outside the system in Washington, D.C. amid a historic election, clashing movement visions, and his own reflections on love, the sensorium of climate change, and temporality.
Ooh, good. Yeah. It's hard with the Matt chapters, but I feel like we're starting to, right, this is the second one.
Yeah.
And I think more so than the second Tony chapter, it feels like him narrating a moment from further in the future. You know what I mean?
And this is an impressive writing feat to pull off, the way in which, like, on a metafictional level, Matt is so self-aware of himself as a writer and so self-consciously doing fancy writing that's like chronicling. Yeah. That, yes, I think that your read is
like,
spot on.
Little was I to know what was coming down the road suggests that he's further down the road, right?
Yeah. 11 years, but also like 11 years ago, I got into her truck. Right. That's how the chapter opens. Right.
Yeah.
So the fact that this is being written from the present, but also from the future, it's just crazy.
It is impressive. And I feel like it captures the present. Like, you don't feel like the present is like, at least in this chapter, it doesn't feel like it's mediated through, decades of reflection. It feels like it's happening in the moment, just in terms of the prose.
Yes. So you're also setting up my overly ambitious Galaxy Brain Flex too, which
amazing.
I appreciate.
Okay, so shall we develop some context and framework for this long form?
Yeah,
piece?
We got a couple characters, right, to mention. Cy Fitzpatrick, the Democratic senator from Pennsylvania, who actually wants to do something about climate. Because he is in the twilight of his career, shall we say, as he acknowledges.
Yeah, for better or for worse, he cares about the American people.
Even though they're like blundering idiots or whatever it is.
I forget.
Or lunatics.
Yes, lunatics. Incredible.
Yeah. We have J.D. Vance. Oh, I'm sorry. It's Russ Murkowski, Republican senator from West Virginia, neo-Confederate, rat fucker, like all of the above.
J.D. Vance, excuse me, Murkowski.
Yeah. Well, there's just this line. As we record this in September 2024, this line about Murkowski where Kate is making fun of Murkowski and she says, "Little prep school kid with a fake drawl playing at right-wing populist." I'm like, Jesus fucking Christ. And obviously Mark Lee is like very much an Ohioan. And J.D. Vance is kind of that.
And I feel like Vance has become more that since the time that this book was published.
It's a great point, right?
It's become more of an apt analogy over time, which is also impressive. Like, do you think he was anticipating that?
I don't know. Like, I did see an interview. There's one line that I'm sure we'll get to where he talks about like the quagmire of climate politics during the Biden years. There was some interview that I watched with Mark Lee where he talks about having to rewrite this part of the book because of the Inflation Reduction Act.
Oh, interesting. Huh. Okay.
Wow. So who else we got? We got more from the Fierce Blue Fire team, right? So same characters, except we add Sandeep to the crew, and we get a kind of different and more intimate point of view of all of them from Matt. Than we got from Onitza and the story a couple episodes ago. And we have our characters starting to cross paths from different point of views, right? So Ash is there.
In the room.
Yeah.
But Matt doesn't know who he is yet.
But
he says, I would come to find later, right?
Incredible.
Yeah.
It's like so obnoxious, and I love it so much.
I don't even find it obnoxious. I love it.
Yeah. And then Holly and Tony get mentioned as well, as Holly is a candidate to lead the New York City field office.
Yeah.
All right. After detouring us, Emily, now I think it's time for our actual context and framework.
Your long form.
I gotta make sure we take a while to get to the point, you know?
Yeah. So what is this essay about, John?
I think you were going to tell us something about climate change and the destruction of civilization.
I do. Okay, so let's go to page 175.
One of my favorite parts of this chapter.
Yes. So this is in the transition between the anecdote about Colbert and the present, quote unquote, where Kate and Matt are going to go to North Carolina to spend Halloween at his parents' house. And he's doing one of those things where he's ruminating on what it all means and how it's all connected. And the kind of transition story that he tells is the story of him coming to some sort of consciousness about the depth and gravity of the problem of climate change, right? So before he met Kate, he never thought about the issue for longer than 30 seconds. And then he starts to do his due diligence, right? It's looming over everything. He congratulates his sister. He chips balls at the Langston golf course, right? But looming over all of it now is a monolith of dread. This dark pillar, painful to confront, nags absently all the time. Because even the people who do understand the science who are maximally frightened, they're in denial as well. When I first heard of the climate Robin Hoods, also another intersection perhaps, blowing up the pipelines on the plains, I wondered what kind of lunacy it took to do that. But really, I was the mad one. I lived my whole life thinking nothing about this. I hadn't realized that the natural cycles of the earth warming and cooling were laughably insufficient explanations, like saying your house fire began because of the arrival of spring, blah, 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 blah. For a while, I stopped sleeping. I'd reach for Kate, who fell asleep instantaneously whenever she felt like, and I would grip her, stuff my face in her thick, fragrant hair, and imagine our children, what kind of frightening, disintegrating civilization they would be born into. And I think that is a fascinating choice of words to end this little existential angst narration with.
Yeah. As a white man prone to existential angst, please tell me more.
I tried to write a paper about this a long time ago that I couldn't get off the ground because I couldn't figure out exactly how to make the argument that I wanted to make. But in almost everything that has a climate apocalypse, like a film or a book, a novel, something that is fictionalized, dramatized, it's okay, we're in a scary setting, there's flooding everywhere, our infrastructure has collapsed or whatever. But it is always also a kind of rumination on what happens to the societies of people sort of left behind, right? Yeah. Almost in a kind of rapture sense. And there's always reason has crumbled, right? People no longer act rationally. Our world isn't ordered, right, in accordance with reason. There's one, do you know J.G. Ballard?
No, I don't.
He's written a bunch of climate changey fiction. One what was that one called? He wrote one that's about a hotel where it's almost like Snowpiercer, but a hotel instead of a train. Mm-hmm. And then in one, it's the water is coming up, and everybody sort of lives on boats and in these weird things. But the closer you get to the equator, the crazier you get. You're literally individuals sort of deteriorate at the level of sanity, but it gets narrated as sort of you lose the ability to make rational choices. And so people get drawn to their deaths because they've lost reason.
Isn't that what a bunch of European quote unquote anthropologists said about people of color living at the tropics in the 17th and 18th centuries? Yeah.
And then they were oh, we could just civilize them. And then maybe they will be quasi-rational. They'll be rational enough that they can obey our orders. So they can be ordered, but they can't order themselves, right? And so this is why we spread democracy, quote unquote, all over the world, right? I just blended 200 years of, of theory together. But I think it's so weird that the thing that's going to crumble is civilization specifically, which implies that whatever is left is not civilized, right? Implies, I think, the specter of the savage.
Yep.
And I think that is so interesting, right? He spends a whole paragraph talking about the earth, right? The carbon concentrations, the speed at which these things are occurring, the house is burning down. But the thing that he's really scared of that keeps him awake at night is that like his children are going to live on a world like populated with savages. Like that's what I read the subtext as. And I think it's wild.
Yeah, I think it's so symptomatic of the imagination, like the colonial imaginations of civilizational collapse. Right?
Yes, yes.
Because it's like, okay, well, what do we have? And you actually pointed out two of them, right? Or maybe like the predominant two. One is the rapture, right? The religious fall, the like religious Messiah comes, et cetera, et cetera. And two is like, we go back into the state of nature, which we have coded as the place where the savages and the less than rational live.
Yeah.
Like those are only two imaginaries, as opposed to the like, the staying with the trouble ethos, right? Or the, arts of living in the Anthropocene, right? Kind of approach of
or on a damaged planet, right? Like,
right. That's the name of the book. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, the Anna Singh collection.
Yep.
Yeah. And I don't know, it just seems so limited to me. But then I'm like, I feel like from the perspective of white guy just learning about this looming disaster, like arts of living on a damaged planet or staying with the trouble might mean something like, oh, if we burn it down faster, we can get beyond the threshold into the thing that comes next. Right? Which does not, like, action on climate change does not flow from that perspective. Right? So I don't know. I have trouble seeing how Matt can get to Haraway from where he is.
No, I think, exactly. That's a much better way of making my point. And I mean, this is great. I hadn't really thought about this because I've always focused on Matt as a character through whom Markley is most trying to explore the felt experience of living amidst climate change and like having a come to Jesus moment, right? To use the name of the storm or the, mix our metaphors yet again. But what you're pointing to is that if we then look what happens when somebody who hasn't thought about it, what is the direction they can go when they become a convert? This is the narrative that they have available to them.
And it like, I'll get to this a little bit in my Galaxy Brain take too, but I think it casts the argument between Kate and Rakia in a different light.
Yes, absolutely.
Right? Like if the stakes are we need to rescue civilization, it's like for who and on what terms, right? And who gets to decide what's civilized enough and who suffers, right? I don't know. I think it's an interesting, I can't land on an argument about it, but it's something I've noticed in a recurring theme in the, like, how we render precisely what kind of apocalypse, right? A climate event that like racks the world. What kind of disaster is it? And like when it's taken up at the level of relationships between and among people and how they organize themselves, it's always this like the collapse of reason thing.
I wonder if if we could make an argument that it's a way of abnegating responsibility that one doesn't understand is abnegating any responsibility because you're so aware of I am serious about the climate doom and climate despair. So thus, of course, I am thinking about and have accounted for like how responsibility functions for that climate doom and catastrophe and its ongoingness and its aftermath, if that's an appropriate term to use, in the sense that like this is a shortcut around that like glances or skirts by capitalism and the racial capitalocene and like all these kinds of notions we could use to think more intensively about responsibility, both for climate change and for living or arts of living or staying with the trouble or responding to that in the moment right now. But if we go straight from, well, we're all fucked and reason and civilization collapse, then we get to skip the harder parts.
Yeah. So abnegating kind of responsibility. But I wonder too if it's not that sort of uncritically accepting the argument that reason is the thing that orders
Mm-hmm.
And so, like, one of the things that gets us from here to there without doing any of the hard work is seeing, like, I'm trying to square this impulse I've noticed with something like the discourse of American anti-intellectualism, or
Yes.
right, like, if we're always already like worried about the unreason all around us, but the worst we can imagine as the collapse of civilization is that like we live in a world that is completely disordered and irrational, like how different is that really from now? A, and B, like, then how does that bear on the problem that I think that you've rightly pointed to, which is that there's a like a temporal, I don't know, like gap or something.
Well, part of the answer to that is that reason gets assumed to be the only possible thing that could save us, right? And it gets
right. If only we could convince everyone to be reasonable, then yeah.
And that reason is viewed as something that is wholly severable from the colonial history and applications and patriarchal history and applications of a particular notion of what rationality or reason is.
Yeah. See, there's like something there, right?
Oh, there's definitely something there. Coming in 2029, Crandall with McMahon in the acknowledgements.
Yes. Ugh, God. This is why I hate doing my own work.
Which is a joke on academic publishing, not a joke on Emily's.
Yeah, but also
capabilities. Her reason, yeah.
An actual description of how long it would take me to do that. Yeah, I don't know. That just like really, it gets me when I see it. You said that that was a point in the chapter that was really interesting to you. Was it a similar thing or a different?
It was more the bottom of 174, the light bulb moment for Matt, than it was the civilizational point. Although you've kind of changed my mind about which of those is more important. Yeah, so I'm teaching this Marx independent study with my students this semester, and we were talking about alienation the other day, and I said, okay, well, one of the questions Marx is interested there is, what does it feel like to experience capitalism? Even if we can analyze capitalist forces in the somewhat like social scientific sense in his view. And I think that Matt is that very useful character for what does experiencing climate change feel like, albeit from his kind of partial standpoint.
Well, and kind of like in the vein of standpoint tradition, he narrates it as a sort of shedding of his prior false consciousness, right? Like he doesn't use that term, but I think that is in essence what he is saying. And so it presumes, right, again, that like everyone else is operating under the guise of something that isn't real or not true about the world. Yeah.
Which maybe a little bit throws into question the way he narrates the rest of this chapter and like the different kind of political battles, because I think there are like some competing motives for Matt, the character, as he talks about what these debates within and outside of FBF here, because he understands himself to be a writer, like presenting accurately something that happened, I think. He also is in a relationship with Kate. He also has a friend crush on Coral. And so like there's this like tendency towards romanticization in the way he narrates like him and Kate, I think in particular. And so thus we can ask ourselves, to what extent does that bleed over to like the possible romanticization of the movement itself?
Yeah.
So like there are all
the moments too that you're like, our children, we built a life together. Like there's all these moments where he's like drawing the point of their relationship out into some place, but they never. It appears as though that's not something that they discuss.
Yeah, Matt Stanton, wife guy.
Yeah,
I don't.
Yeah.
But at the same time, he's totally willing to show Kate being an asshole and other people being an asshole to Kate, and like I don't necessarily take all of those things to doubt the veracity internal to the logic of the novel of the argument that happens after this meeting with Patrick and Mikowski. Yeah.
Interesting. Do we want to say anything about, I feel like we've been talking a lot about kind of his writing style, but wonder too, this chapter, kind of how it sits with the rest of the book. Like, I think there's another kind of like juxtaposition between the stylistic choices of the opening and the closing, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we're talking about, like, I think some epistemic questions about his narration, right? Like,
yeah.
And again, sort of the time jump. When is he writing? But there's also, we've been tracking, right, these like the closing passages and the sort of like how they transition. But the beginning, you mentioned this already, but the first sentence is just a sentence, right? 11 years earlier, I got into her truck, which feels very stylized.
It's extremely stylized.
And then it's like, drawing the connections between their journey, his journey, and the journey of the org, the journey of the movement. Mm-hmm. And then it ends with this like story, right? A memory. So it's outside of the present of the chapter.
What that requires us to define what the present of the chapter is, which is both maybe impossible and B, cryptic foreshadowing territory.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's supposed to be when it's set, right? 2028, yeah. Mm-hmm. Right? So it's after the meeting, before the election.
Great.
It's October of 2028.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
But then he ends the chapter with a story that's a memory. They're like in North Carolina together, and he's all wounded because he didn't know she had friends there, and she's had a whole life before him, which, like, get over it. They're hiking under a waterfall. They make out, blah, blah, blah. And then he just tells this story, right? We put our clothes back on. She's feeding him apples that she cuts from a knife. And as the sun set, the stars came out and the green forested mountains were limned with the silver light of a quarter moon. Of course, she knew most of the constellations. She put her head against mine so I could follow her index finger as she traced the line of Cassiopeia and told me stories I've long forgotten about this queen of the northern sky. Like, what do we make of that as a closing?
Well, first,
I laughed so hard at that paragraph, and then I felt bad because I was like, he's being so earnest.
Yeah.
But it's so cheesy.
Yes. And I suspect purposely so. Mm-hmm. I have to say the first two times I read that, I wasn't, I guess, paying close enough attention, and I wanted to go to a different myth other than Cassiopeia. Like, I wanted to think about Cassandra, right? And so I read it as Kate as the Cassandra character or the Cassandra figure of climate change, which isn't actually what happened.
No, that's really good. Yeah, I mean,
Wikipedia tells us of famed scholarly source that Cassiopeia was known as arrogant and vain, and that led to her downfall.
Yeah. Like, what? That's so funny.
On so many levels, and some of which we can't get into right now for spoiler reasons. But
yeah, I thought that's an interesting way to end the chapter.
Yeah, sorry, now I'm just in Cassiopeia Wikipedia.
That's really funny.
Losing it.
I think so. What I was struck by, to me, there's like almost a juvenile quality to the opening statement and the closing paragraph.
Oh, great.
That I think is like a really interesting bookend to the chapter, because I think he comes off as like more mature and self-reflective in his discussions of kind of what's at stake, right? In the like nitty gritty of the politicking and in the disagreements, right? Between and among the members of A Fierce Blue Fire. But both of these seem like very like the Matt who thought he had something to write, so he struck out west to Wyoming. Mm-hmm. Like, I see that Matt in the opening sentence and the closing paragraph. And I thought that was really interesting. And I wondered if it was intentional. And if so, like, what purpose that serves sort of functionally.
Matt is kind of the naïf, right? Mm-hmm. In the story, in the climate world in Washington, D.C., and you're right that on some level he's aware of that. Like, I'm thinking about the moment earlier in the chapter when they're meeting with Fitzpatrick and Mikowski. Mm-hmm. And like Matt says like 3 words, and we're ready, I added, and felt sweat on my brow as all eyes briefly found me. Kate threw me with a smile, and I could tell she was happy with that line. It's like the little boy said the thing. He did
good
a
job.
trick, good job, pat him on the head. He was very nervous about it. So yeah, there's something about like youthful naivete in Matt's chapter.
Do you think it's an appeal to the readers that like you too can be naive and and filled with childlike wonder and also like devastated by climate change, or like, or is this Stephen Markley? Like,
I'm very strongly behind the Matt is the most stand-in for the author character in this novel. And so, I mean, I'd be interested, what was Stephen Markley's like come to Jesus about climate change like, and to what extent does he see that aspect of Matt's arc as paralleling his own in some form? I mean, I think that's possibly it. I think it's also possible in the sense of if this book was only about climate diehards, then the novel in advance is unable to achieve what we can understand to be a possible purpose of climate fiction, of trying to get readers through the conventions and trappings and workings of fiction to experience and relate to climate change in a different way. Like, if everyone's a climate diehard, then no one who's not already a climate diehard is necessarily going to connect with anything in here. So, like, I think that's a very simple answer, but I think that's a possibility.
Well, and that exactly parallels Kate's argument for working across the aisle, right? That like, if you're only already talking to people who agree with you, then you're not moving.
Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting.
So Matt sees himself as an emblem of that statement writ small.
I think so, but also he's like romantic, and I think romantic. It's interesting that we get this like, oh, I can't sleep at night. I'm in the depths of despair. I've been awoken. And also like in my heart, I'm just a simple romantic boy.
Yes. Who wants to golf in North Carolina
and like have children with Kate. It's interesting. And I think the Kate Rakia argument is a little bit in a way about that. Can you be like, for Kate, it's not romance, right? It's like, can you have fun? Can you fuck around? Right. And be serious. And for Rakia, it's like, how can you fuck around when this stuff is so serious, but also there's so many other so serious things. And then Matt's like, I don't know, like the kind of golden boy in the middle who gets away with like privilege in a sense. I don't know.
I thought you were going to say golden retriever.
Oh yeah. I mean, that's what I meant. Like, hey guys, can't we all get along? Also marry me.
But he is the peacemaker, right? Like he goes to Rakia, right? After this fight happens, he and Kate seemingly have a relationship where like they don't have to talk about it to have come to an understanding about it. And like, Kate's text about Kate apologies, implying the regularity of this kind of stuff. But the fight between Rakia and Kate about whether or not to accept this, rat fucking deal presented by Mikowski and Fitzpatrick is really, really excellent. Because I think it so excellently captures the sincerity and I think like clarity of both of their respective positions. Like, I don't think he's stacking the deck for one character over the other. Like, I don't think, even if other characters like Tom think that Rakia is like an SJW who, isn't serious enough or whatever, I don't think that Matt, as the, writer of this chapter, or Markley as the author, thinks that Rakia is unserious or thinks that like Kate is obviously articulating the better argument, better plan. Like, I think that there is something real about the debate that happens between the two.
I mean, that's the dialectic, right? They're both right. Yeah.
And yet they have to act. So that's the Schmidt that I'm not doing, but that I thought about. Was Kate has to act because this is encased in this longer argument, and this is one of these like movementy things that I was fascinated about. Is this notion that like Fierce Blue Fire is ostensibly like believes in some democratic norms, but Kate is the dictator of it.
I actually thought this chapter raised a lot of interesting questions about democracy more broadly.
Please go for it.
Should we go there? I was thinking about one, like, what do we do when we talk about democracy? Are we talking about a set of ideas? Are we talking about like arrangement of institutions? or just like a practice.
That's great.
And I think that we get kind of like little tastes of all three, right? You have the senator who's on his way out, right? Literally saying like, I'm here for the people, but like also there's this sort of almost, Federalist Papersy, like they can't be trusted to act on their own behalf. So I have
James
to do
Madison
it for them.
reappears.
Right.
Yeah.
But I think also this question of compromise is, or like how to come to a decision in a democratic either context or institution, like what constitutes a decision, right? And like when does compromise itself sort of, I don't know, water down, right? The democratic, what's the word I'm looking for? A mandate, right? Like that something is sort of an actual expression of democratic will, right? Or of the people in some way. Like, and where do we draw the line on what constitutes like a good compromise versus a bad compromise, whether that's procedurally or in terms of its content? And I think this chapter like really plays with a lot of that questions. Like, Matt's like, these senators have these like secret rooms that only their aides know about, but like actually they're not that fancy, right? There's like all this like mundane juxtaposed with something. I think it's less sublime in this chapter, but like with something sort of bigger than mundane.
It's the normal versus emergency, I think is the analogy.
And I thought, but I don't think that this chapter anyway really answers any of those questions. I think it just sort of throws them all up there and like shakes them around.
Yeah, which is fine. Like I actually would rather that in some ways. Like it's like a China Miéville novel that answers those questions in a more extended way.
But I was thinking about too, like the conversation between, or the argument between Kate and Rikia is at its root an argument about how or whether democracy can reckon with its past, right?
Yes.
In some way. And I think it raises the questions of like, who really are parties to the social contract if we still do think that there is some sort of contractual basis for like how we act in a political sense, both like literally as people doing politics, but also sort of communally as people in a political situation with each other, right? And like, it was making me think about some of the difficulties that people have sort of making successful arguments for something like reparations, or for something like holding a country or a corporation accountable for past polluting, right? Is that like the parties to the social contract in the liberal, political, philosophical sense are so narrowly circumscribed, right? It's this like individual with property in their person, and the expression of that property is labor, right? And so like, how do you add a party to that contract that's like a group of people who are dead? Like, I don't know. But I think this
ironically,
chapter,
Burke had something to say about that, which is
funny. I think this chapter is dealing with all of that.
It's dealing with that in the context of what decisions do we make, as you pointed out, in a democracy in the present, right? And what is the appropriate like depth of field or depth of vision for us making those decisions, right? Because like Kate sees Randall to some extent, not exclusively and not to the extent I think that Rikia accuses her of, but sees Randall as the culmination of Fierce Blue Fire on some level, right? And I think for Kate, like that might be working a little bit unconsciously, but Kate would say she sees the policy that Randall is willing to pass and push through Congress as the culmination, or is a culmination on the route to some further culmination on a path that they're building beyond that. But like, I think that Rikia's points about how do you actually deal with institutionalizing political change in the context of like a large, representative quasi-democracy like the US is such an excellent presentation of that conundrum, right? So like from thinking about 177 or so, right? She says, our neutrality to political personalities is a strength. This is Rikia. They will always come and go, and they can always betray the cause in a blink of an eye. Randall feels nice because she comes with that deceptive post-racial afterglow, and y'all feel like Kate here grew her in a vat for the moment and this movement. She's proof of the concept to you. That does not mean she'll do what needs to be done, though. And they kind of go back and forth on that particular point, which is okay, if we step in and like make a slight deviation from our emphasis on the processes and practices of our movement now, what happens after?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
With this not being a democracy between the two of them.
Well, right. And
Right.
I also wondered whether that was supposed to be, are those supposed to be analogs, right? The back channel wheeling and dealing between senators on opposite sides of the aisle and then like this literal self-identifying or self-touting, right? A democratic organization. Its inner workings are like totalitarian, right?
Mm-hmm.
And is that an argument that Mark Lee's making about the nature of our democratic processes, or is it just a wink? I don't know.
I think we can both end that one, right? And in part because of like Rikia's statement on the next page, right after the great Nexium line, or any of the 30,000 decisions that get made around here basically by you and you alone, while you pretend there's any kind of consensus building or democratic input, right? Which is both an indictment of like lack of democratic practices within the social movement, and as you just pointed out, an indictment of representative democracy. Maybe it's Rousseau time.
Is that where you're taking us?
No, definitely not.
Oh my God.
I should know.
I'm sure it'll come up eventually.
Yeah. He's always in the storehouse.
Mm-hmm.
Also, like, this chapter is just so much about the contrast between the vision and growth of Fierce Blue Fire when it, and it's ironic that it like understands itself as doing the exact opposite of the rat fuckery of this chapter and of Washington, D.C. But at the moment at which the movement gets confronted and enticed to become a part of the rat fuckery, like that's the crisis point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So how do we want to characterize that crisis point?
Should we go into the Galaxy Brain takes and overly ambitious flexes? Because I have a thought.
You know what? Yeah, I think that's a good move.
Okay. So I will present, after considering some other options, I think that the appropriate Galaxy Brain is to use Walter Benjamin to think about this chapter.
Ooh, I love
and
that.
The politics of this chapter, right? So like, I'm kind of taking off from the fragment from the arcades that probably gets used the most by him, right? Perhaps Marx says that revolutions are the locomotives of world history, but the situation may be quite different. Perhaps revolutions are not the train ride, but the human race grabbing for the emergency brake, right? So like that's the kind of classic quote from Benjamin. And I think we can kind of start there because I think that like Kate and Rikia are arguing about how and when to grab for the emergency brake in the politics around them, right, in world history. And that like the fact that this is a book about climate change adds this like additional historical and temporal and like ultimately messianic in a Benjaminian way sort of dimension to Benjamin's ideas about world history. So I was thinking about that quote, which got me thinking like more broadly about on the concept of history in relationship to this particular chapter and like to these questions about politics and emergency and all of that. And so I thought I might read Thesis 8 from On the Concept of History by Benjamin. The tradition of the oppressed teaches us that the state of emergency in which we live is not the exception, but the rule. We must attain a conception of history that is in keeping with this insight. Then we shall clearly realize that it is our task to bring about a real state of emergency, and that this will improve our position in the struggle against fascism or climate catastrophe, I would add. One reason why fascism has a chance is that in the name of progress, its opponents treat it as the historical norm. The current amazement is that the things we are experiencing are, quote unquote, still possible in the 20th century is not philosophical. And then I would then turn to Thesis 6. To articulate the past historically does not mean to recognize in it the way it really was. It means to seize hold of a memory as it flashes up at a moment of danger.
Ooh.
Right? So to me, like so much about the political questions within this chapter are what is the appropriate mechanism to take like the wreckage of history that the angel of history is looking back upon as it's borne ceaselessly forward, at the level of climate change as it intersects with the constant state of emergency that is a climate fucked United States with a bunch of white supremacists in the government.
Mm-hmm.
And like, what is the reformist or non-reformist supposed to do in that moment? And that the argument of between Kate and Rakia brought to the level of Benjamin on world history is a debate about like what it means to think about like the redemption that Benjamin talks about on the concept of history, or to think about the messianic power, right? That he talks about, that like, so this is thesis 2. There's a secret agreement between past generations and the present one. Like I hadn't realized I'd forgotten how much like Benjamin's concept of history is about like intergenerational politics and justice. Our coming was expected on earth. Like every generation that preceded us, we have been endowed with a weak messianic power, a power to which the past has a claim. That claim cannot be settled cheaply. Historical materialists are aware of that. And there's like something about the need to seize hold of the memory as it flashes up, like with the fact that thing that we are like adding memory to, in this case, like the history that leads to climate change, the white supremacy, the settler colonialism, the colonial capitalism, all of those sorts of things. Like, what claim does that put on the actual actors and agents of history in this chapter? And like, there's a way in which I think Benjamin helps situate that debate on that like gigantic planetary scale in a way that like as excessive, as productive of excess as Benjamin is in a certain way. Like, I don't think it's overly grandiose excess, especially when we think about like the politics of climate.
Yeah. It's weird. So one way I think to read your take is that like climate change like sort of proves Benjamin right.
Yeah, exactly. That's a much better way of saying it, right? Like little did we know that Angelus Novus all along, like was looking at like fucking climate disaster.
I am so convinced by that. I mean,
that's the article that we're
also
writing.
Though about like reparations and the problem of like intergenerational accountability and responsibility and justice. And it's like, yeah, that it's baked in, but that the stakes are particularly salient, I think, in the context of climate change. But I think flowing from the history of colonialism and all that other kind of stuff, I think that I don't, maybe like climate change clarifies Benjamin.
Yeah, maybe that's the way to put it. And I think that's probably better, more precise. And also like this chapter begins and closes with like, well, what is normal or normality, right? That's essentially what they end up thinking about. And there's like, whether it's COVID, the murder of George Floyd, and the 2020 election on January 6th, right? Which seems exceptional, but becomes kind of normal, right? So it's that constant state of emergency idea. Whether it's like, they're all getting ready for the Halloween party, and it's like there was news about a school shooting in which I think it's like 14 Somali children, right, are murdered, and like they just remark on it and they go about their
and they go about put your phone away.
Yeah, exactly. But the things that they are declaring as normal, like ultimately, like Return of the Oppressed will always come back, right? And it's whether that's Russ Mikowski and like, and white supremacists in government, or whether that is that they have this blow up argument between Kate and Matt's dad about the school shootings that leads to being about Matt not playing enough golf anymore. And like, then that's the like end of that relationship for now.
Yeah.
The like Kate, Matt's parents, Matt, his parents' relationship.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's what I got. I hope that was appropriately Galaxy.
I just feel like now if anyone is teaching Benjamin and not using climate change as a way to like work out the argument, I just don't know what you're doing. I am fully convinced.
Teaching tips with We Are the Deluge.
I know, right? Okay, so unsurprisingly, I also wanted us to think about what this chapter is saying vis-a-vis what course to take politically, right? What actions do we take? What course of action is called for by the times? And I was thinking about this Kate and Rakia argument. I'm gonna have us read their argument with Hanna Pitkin's read of Fortune in Machiavelli.
Yes. I'm so here for this.
Which I thought you would find amusing because I'm obviously teaching it.
It's appropriate. Like, this is Ross Pacheski, the true author of The Overly Ambitious Flex.
Yes, and women and gender in Western political thought is just always with me. Okay, so Hanna Pitkin writes a whole book on the figure of Fortune in Machiavelli. It's called Fortune is a Woman, right? But essentially, the question is how to understand, like, given, right, that Fortune has sort of several permutations and several iterations in Machiavelli that have different consequences for how we understand what his view is. Like, how do we reconcile those differences, if at all? And so there's the kind of like famous passage right at the end of The Prince, or the chapter, right, about Fortune, where he talks about Fortune as a river and you have to build up the dikes to prevent against the flooding.
Yep.
But, right, you can't always prepare in advance. And so really, Fortune is a woman, and like women, right, she favors the young, the bold, the impetuous. So it is better, right, to beat her down than it is to placate her, right? And so Pitkin,
to bear the vicissitudes of Fortune or something like that.
So Pitkin reads Machiavelli as saying, okay, so either Fortune is a woman and you have to seduce her, right? Or you have some sort of sexual relationship with her, or you have to free yourself with her. So, and like, this is a problem because Machiavelli is sort of like regarded as the theorist of action, right?
Yes.
Like, the purpose of political life is to consult history, right, for an insight into what we should do, how we should act, not like what is the ideal city state, right?
Precisely.
But like, how should we?
He famously rejects that, right? Yeah. Or in the preface to chapter 1 of The Prudence. Right?
Yeah. So like, how should we act right now in this moment, given the problems that we're currently facing? And Pitkin reads him as setting up this sort of like two opposing potential relationships, right? Like, virtue is the masculine sort of mode of action that is in some way, in some relationship to Fortune, right? And I think Fortune is particularly relevant in the context of climate change, given that, right, in Renaissance Italy, it's often like a flood, there's a storm, right? And so it's either these like uncontrollable, unpredictable rivers that are at any moment threatening to flood us, right? Floods again. Or like, it's this woman who is unpredictable, whose potential to interfere, right, in our life is so great that we have to do something, right? We have to act in some way. So the consequences of these two dynamics set up, right, two different relations. So she says that on the one hand, it sets up this, like, either you have to woo her, right, or commit sexual violence against her, or you have to liberate yourself from her. So it's like two different trajectories. Either in some way you intertwine, right? Like, virtue and Fortune become intertwined with one another, but the specific dynamic sort of depends, right? Is it one of like mutual wooing, or is it one of sexual conquest? Right. Or you have to conduct yourself such that your fate runs, or your life, or your path runs parallel to Fortune's path, and she does not cross in any way yours. And Pitkin is like, these are two opposite things, and they yield two opposite requirements for action. One is prudence, and the other is boldness, right?
Yes.
And the other problem that Pitkin sees, or what she calls like an ambiguity in Machiavelli, is that it is unclear in his work who the relevant unit of analysis is for virtue. Okay, so like, is it that we individually are kind of locked in political struggle as individuals against Fortune, but also against one another, right? Or is it that like collectively we are locked in a political struggle against something sort of bigger than us, right? Is virtue a collective project, or is it an individual project?
Which is, if I remember correctly, the same dilemma about autonomy. Is it individual or collective?
Do we have autonomy is sort of the philosophical question that flows from the setting up of this dynamic of the potential relationships between virtue and fortuna, right? So I think if Kate is confronting Fortune with boldness, then maybe in a way Rakia is right about her criticism of Kate.
Ooh. Continue.
Okay, so So if boldness is ultimately about establishing or kind of winning autonomy from Fortune via conquering her, right? We act so that we're not going with caution. We're not guarding against the potential, right? Like different paths of disaster we anticipate based on the record, right? Like might arise. We are going to conquer her with a bold action. Is that really a collective project, or is that ultimately an individual project? And I think Rakia thinks about like the cultivation of virtue, if we can, or virtue as guiding action as necessarily a collective political project, right? That is like only sort of together accounting for, right, these multiple sort of interests at stake and these multiple avenues for disaster, right? That like only collectively can we actually guard against, right? Build dikes sort of strong enough to guard against the literal threat of the storm, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think for Kate, even though she frames it as a collective issue, right? We need to do this, otherwise we won't have momentum that we need so that we can do something else. That it ultimately is about establishing not a relationship between like everyone on Earth and the storm, but sort of like freeing Kate from, right, the trappings of a system that is like adequately prepared for meeting the storm. So like, I will conquer the storm at the same time as like Italy gets flooded is sort of like, I think maybe what Kate's missing. I don't know. It's not a perfect one-to-one, but it struck me that reading it through Pitkin, reading their debate and the sort of stakes of it through Pitkin's analysis makes Kate, I think, seem a little more myopic, maybe somewhat paradoxically, given like her like stated goal, if that makes sense. I don't know.
It does make sense. So if I could just really push the Pitkin categories way too hard, like is it that Kate is the fox who wants Randall to kind of be the founder, and Rakia is offering us the citizen?
Ooh. Or Kate is the lion who has not learned how to be both fox and lion. I don't know, because I feel like Kate, but maybe she has been lion and is now embracing fox.
There we go. That's it.
She's called by Machiavelli's sort of suggestion, right? That like it is the fox ultimately is going to get you closer to where you want to be, because it's less about actually meeting people's needs or desires and more about appearing to, right? And so that you can have something different running public facing as opposed to internally, right? It's for Machiavelli a course of action because it can get you what you want more effectively, right? Or you're beholden less to the sort of whims of others. And so he guides, right? He says the fox is the right choice. And so Kate's at this impasse, right? And she's like, do I want to continue to be the lion? Do I want to be the fox? And she's going fox. And Rakia is saying, you're getting it wrong. You've not taken Machiavelli's ambiguities enough to heart.
Yeah. Fierce Blue Fire production of Mandragola Wren.
Yes.
Can I add on also to your fortune and climate change analogy? And much like you said, well, okay, if you're not teaching Benjamin through climate change, you're wrong. You're doing it wrong. Like now, if you're not teaching Machiavelli through climate change, you're doing it wrong.
I feel like
because there's something about the fortune aspect. I think like you're exactly right to think about it like quite literally in terms of storms and like rivers overflowing their banks and all of that. But I think there's also a sense in which like if we think about feedback loops, right? The name of this part of the novel. Or we just think about like the kind of uncertainties and the inability to fully control, predict, shape, determine outcomes, right? Due to the inherent like chaos and unpredictability and like, like long walks in different directions that one isn't expecting and all of those kinds of things, that there's something very, and here I'm thinking about like Carolyn Merchant, there's something very, we cannot control nature, and every attempt to try to control, including control through prediction, is in fact like, doomed to fail before it's even begun. And in part, that's for Fortuna reasons. Like the feedbacks are the Fortuna and the tipping points are the Fortuna and all of that.
Yeah. So I think like a kind of cynical reading of both like Pitkin's take on Machiavelli and also somebody like Wendy Brown's is that, okay, we ultimately cannot control nature. So like the best we can hope for is like exercising some control over other people. I think that's a cynical take, but like, there are seeds of it there, right? And it is gendered in Machiavelli for sure.
It is, and it's also a different way of understanding the dilemma that Kate faces as a character.
Yeah,
because as grandiose as her visions are, and like as extensive as her political envisioning process is, she still had to deal with her and Fierce Blue Fire becoming, like over the span of a couple of years, the most important social movement in the United States, right? And getting high-level secret meetings with two of the more powerful senators, right? And there's something about the elevation to that status so quickly that one can't prepare for in advance. And, and that like it requires some Machiavelli, all the different figures within Machiavelli, right? It requires Fox and Lion. Requires citizen and prince. It requires all of these figures to be able to have to navigate with that particular form of uncertainty relationship to power.
And in that sense, I think Machiavelli gives us like a slightly different read on the Colbert situation, right? Like we were sort of laughing, like, is it realistic that one appearance on that show makes her the sort of stand-in for the cause, right, of all these media companies divesting from fossil fuels or whatever. But like that's a fluke, right? It was just a circumstance of the situation of the times, right? Yeah. And it took advantage of it, right? She exercised virtue in that moment, and the two combined, right, like yielded this outcome that she probably wasn't going in there thinking like, I'm gonna change all of the landscape of media with this one appearance, right? But like, saw an opportunity and went with it, right? And it was the right moment, so the tide changed, right?
Yeah. And she does have, and she has the ambition to act with virtue when the moment calls for. Right. Which is something else that Machiavelli appreciates.
Yeah. We went very old school political theory today.
That's because we're having to prove that we're not just apophenics SJWs.
I sort of love teaching Machiavelli. It's very fun.
It's funny. I've been like kind of thinking maybe I should turn my feminist theory class like back more towards women and gender and Western PT.
It works. I mean, it gives them, I find it makes my students actually interested in reading the dead guys because they want to critique it. But I'm like, you can't just say they're old and dead and they got stuff wrong. Like, that's not interesting.
Exactly.
So like, let's figure out how to say something interesting about it.
Yeah. Let's figure out how to say something interesting. Our eternal mission in front of the classroom and in front of these microphones.
So true. Speaking of interesting.
Oh, look at that.
Shall we turn to clever turns of phrase?
What a fucking hilarious chapter, and like things that I don't know that I wanted to laugh at, but which are just really, really funny.
Everything Tom says gets me.
That's my first note as well.
Yeah. I wrote everything Tom says, just literally. But there were a couple that really, really chuffed me.
You're in the big leagues now, Stanton, but don't worry. Once you watch these esteemed members finger every turkey wrap on the tray before picking one, you quit going gooey.
Like, absolutely incredible. So gross. I also really, really died at the him describing Liza as a one-woman Cambridge Analytica. Just like, that's such a dark take, but like, and it's just offered there without anything else. And I thought that was really, really awesome. What else? Here's a couple other funny ones.
Fitzpatrick, you turn this into a one-issue election. Climate, biospheric crisis, this, oceanous acid bath, that. That's like, maybe Cy Fitzpatrick is Joe Biden.
Yeah.
Right? Much like McCaskey is J.D. Vance.
Yeah. I also liked his outburst about President Hogan. He says, fuck this woman. Hogan won't even fucking meet with us. She pours our ass from vial to vial, and I'm sick of being in a fucking test tube listening to her excuses.
Yeah.
Just Oh, and then there's one that like Matt actually flags as like, where is he?
Can I add on to the Cy Fitzpatrick about Hogan?
Yes.
Like, all she really cares about is slaughtering uppity Arabs half a world away because she knows it gets the blob, the press, everyone in this town hard as a rock.
Like, so good. So funny. The other one, this is on 181. We need to keep Tony Pietrus as far the fuck away from the movement as we can. He doesn't put his foot in his mouth. He shoves in the whole leg up to the fucking hip socket. And then Matt says, I wondered if Tom sat around thinking up these crude bon mots. Like, what it's just a funny juxtaposition. That one really made me laugh a lot.
Mm-hmm. I also appreciated like Liza's sardonic humor and recognizing how funny other people's stuff that they say is, right? So this is 176. I feel like they're deciding when exactly Joe Hogan started hating Fierce Blue Fire. And Liza says, I feel like the well may have been poisoned when Kate called her the drone assassin in chief with the vagina.
Call me crazy. Yeah. She's good.
And lastly, since we've done Machiavelli and Fortuna and Pitkin, so we have to then talk about this joke that Matt and Kate have towards the end.
Yes.
About like what was so Kate, just trying to figure out what I did in another life to deserve you. Probably charged a Confederate line, just you and your bayonet. Such a masculine interpretation of heroism. Matt says, you're a masculine interpretation of heroism, which is correct.
I guffawed at that. Also, like, I'm fairly certain my own partner is named Matt, and he's also a white guy. He's not from North Carolina, but I'm pretty sure we've had that same exact conversation before. Wait, there's one more that really made me laugh.
Please.
When the girls at Halloween are dressed like Kate, and one of them starts crying. And then
that is better than meeting Kate Blanchett.
Oh yeah, this is better than meeting Kate Blanchett. But Matt says, she said inexplicably, this is better than meeting Kate Blanchett, and for whatever reason, this made everyone laugh very, very hard. Like, it is funny.
It is. I like the read we're supposed to take, right? Is that like obviously Kate Blanchett is like a lesbian icon, or an icon among lesbians, I should say.
Yeah.
Right. And so like Matt doesn't get that, but Stephen Markley does. Is that that's how I interpret that joke.
Yeah, I think it is.
Inexplicably.
Yeah.
That Markley's like, haha, I know this.
This is funny. And Matt's like, I don't get it. Yeah. Oh my God. So good. Shall we propose some titles?
Yes, I was going to go with a long formy one, but then I realized that there's another style of long form headlines, which is just an evocative phrase that doesn't really tell you anything about what's to happen, but it sounds very important. So I chose the phrase from very early on in the chapter, and my proposed episode title is simply The Sensation of... Let me take that again. 3, 2. So I chose just one phrase from early in the chapter, and I propose for our episode title, The Sensation of Density.
Ooh, I like that a lot. I was still going to try to go with a play on the years of, just as a meta reference to Matt's own chapters. But the ones I came up with, I'm sort of unsatisfied with. That I kind of like your idea to adapt Prudence and Boldness to a potential title. But we can say...
If The Sensation of Density, the years of Prudence and Boldness.
I'm not opposed to that title.
Done. Sold. Sign me up.
Amazing. All right. So what do we have up next? We have the second chapter from Shane's perspective. Shane rides the Panopticon. That's literally what it's called.
That's literally what it's called.
Oh my God. Okay.
And that is not only because of the title doesn't hurt, probably my single favorite chapter in the whole book.
Wow. So are we going to have to like each do Foucault? Like, what's the... Okay.
I think that's the appropriate... But we're not allowed to actually do the pen. We're not actually allowed to discipline and punish.
Yeah, no problem. Not a problem. All right.
Didn't think it would be.
Stay tuned for Shane 2, Shane Rides the Panopticon, set in 2028, and the theory section of which will be Emily and John ride the Panopticon with Foucault.
With Foucault, what I've always wanted to do.
I mean, yeah, I want to go to that amusement park immediately. Oh, thank you for tuning in to this episode of We Are the Deluge.
And we are the Deluge.